When governments say stability, they often mean moving the cost quietly onto savers. I want to start with a feeling I hear all the time. People say to me, I did what I was supposed to do, I worked hard, I saved. I didn't speculate, and yet somehow it feels like I'm falling behind. That feeling isn't irrational, and it isn't personal failure. It's usually a signal that something structural is happening underneath the surface. I've studied these systems for decades, and when I hear that frustration show up across different income levels in different countries, I treat it the same way a doctor treats recurring symptoms. You don't dismiss it. You ask what's causing it, because when large numbers of people feel like they're running faster but standing still, the issue is rarely effort. It's usually the system they're operating inside. Here's the pattern. Interrupt most people miss. Money is not managed primarily to protect purchasing power. It's managed to keep the overall system from breaking during stress. Once you really internalize that, a lot of confusing things suddenly make sense. Let me be very clear about the thesis, because I think clarity matters here. Governments don't primarily manage money to preserve purchasing power. They manage it to keep the system functioning when it's under pressure. That's not a judgment. It's an observation based on history and incentives. This isn't about conspiracy. I don't think there's a room where people sit around deciding how to hurt savers. That's not how systems work. This is about mechanics. It's about what happens when debt levels are high, obligations are fixed, and political tolerance for pain is low. In those environments, leaders choose the path that keeps things moving, even if that path quietly transfers costs over time. I've seen this moving many times before. Different decades, different currencies, different leaders, but the same underlying logic. When the system is healthy, money feels stable. When the system is strained, money becomes a tool. So before we get emotional about it, I want to slow this down and explain the basic machinery. Because once you understand what money actually is, you stop being surprised by how it's treated. Most people think of money as wealth. They look at a number in their bank account and assume it represents something solid and preserved. But money isn't wealth. Money is a claim. It's a claim on goods and services that exist now or will exist in the future. If I give you $1, I'm not giving you value itself. I'm giving you the right to exchange that dollar for a slice of what the economy produces. That distinction sounds subtle, but it's everything. Because claims can be created more easily than real goods and services. This is where I like to use a biological analogy, because it helps make the mechanics intuitive. Think of the economy like a body. Production is the muscles and organs. Goods and services are the output. Money and credit are the circulatory system. They move buying power through the body so work can get done. When the circulatory system is healthy, blood flows smoothly. When there's stress, the body adapts. It pumps harder. It dilates vessels. It does whatever it can to keep the organs alive. Governments do the same thing with money. Credit expansion isn't inherently bad. In fact, it's necessary for growth. But when you accumulate too much debt, it's like plaque building up in the arteries. The system becomes sensitive. Small shocks create big problems. At that point, tightening too much can cause a heart attack. So policymakers choose to keep things flowing. This is why money gets expanded during stress. Not because leaders wake up wanting inflation, but because the alternative is collapse. Inflation, in that sense, is not an accident. It's a pressure valve. It releases tension gradually instead of all at once. People often ask, why don't they just stop printing? That question assumes money is managed like a household budget. It's not. It's managed like emergency medicine. You stabilize first. You worry about side effects later. Now that we've clarified what money really is, we can move into diagnosis. This is the part where I like to look at the health indicators, because systems leave clues. When I examine debt levels, I'm not making a moral statement, I'm looking at constraints. High debt limits choices. It means more income is pre-committed to servicing past promises. Historically, when debt gets too high relative to income, something has to give. You either cut spending, raise taxes, default outright, or reduce the real value of those debts through inflation. Democracies tend to choose the least visible option. Interest rates are another vital sign. Rates tell you the price of time and risk. When rates are low for long periods, it's usually not because everything is safe. It's because the system can't tolerate higher rates without stress. That creates impossible trade-offs. Raise rates and you hurt borrowers and governments. Keep them low and you slowly erode savers. Inflation is often misunderstood as just higher prices. I look at it as a signal of the imbalance between money and real output. When inflation persists, it's telling you that claims are growing faster than what the system can actually produce. That's not random, it's diagnostic. Government deficits are similar. People argue about them ideologically, but I look at them clinically. Deficits are symptoms. They tell you promises exceed resources. Over time, those gaps get financed through borrowing or money creation. Again, the burden doesn't vanish. It just shifts. Then there's the quiet divergence between asset prices and wages. This is one of the most important indicators people feel but don't measure. When financial assets rise faster than incomes, wealth concentrates. Those who own assets feel stable. Those who rely on wages feel squeezed. That tension doesn't show up immediately in GDP, but it shows up socially and politically. When I put all these indicators together, I don't see chaos. I see stress. I see a system doing what systems have always done when pressure builds. Adjust internally to avoid fracture. Now let me put this in historical context. I've seen this pattern enough times that it no longer shocks me, but I understand why it shocks people living through it. When you're inside the moment, it feels unprecedented. When you step back and study history the way I do, it feels familiar. This is the same movie, just with different actors and better special effects. Whenever governments face the same set of constraints, high debt, social pressure, and limited tolerance for visible pain, they reach for the same tools. They don't usually take money outright. That creates backlash. Instead, they change the character of money itself. They stretch it, they dilute it, they redefine what stable means over time. I've studied periods where debts grew faster than incomes and obligations outpaced productivity. In those environments, preserving the face value of money became less important than preserving the continuity of the system. Savers weren't told they were paying a cost. They just noticed gradually that what their money could buy kept shrinking. This is how stability is often preserved, not by dramatic resets, but by quiet adjustments. The rules don't break, they bend. Contracts are honored in nominal terms while their real value erodes. From a system perspective, that's rational. It avoids mass defaults, it keeps employment going, it reduces the risk of outright collapse. People sometimes ask why leaders don't choose a cleaner solution. The answer is incentives. Sharp, visible pain tends to be politically and socially destabilizing. Gradual, dispersed pain tends to be tolerated longer. So history shows us the same trade-off again and again. Stability first, distributional consequences later. What's important to understand is that these outcomes weren't driven by bad intentions. They were driven by arithmetic. When claims exceed resources, something has to adjust. If you don't reduce claims explicitly, you reduce them implicitly. That's the mechanism. Once you see that, you stop personalizing it. You stop asking who's to blame and start asking what pressures are at work. And that brings us to why this is happening now, not just why it's happened before. When I look at the current environment, I don't see one force. I see several acting together, reinforcing each other. That's when systems feel tight. The first force is debt itself. High debt changes behavior. It makes economies more sensitive to interest rates and more dependent on continued liquidity. It limits how much tightening the system can absorb before stress shows up elsewhere. Debt doesn't just sit there, it shapes every policy decision around it. The second force is internal social tension. When wealth gaps widen and people feel the system is no longer fair, tolerance for austerity drops. That matters. It constrains what policymakers can realistically do. You can't separate monetary decisions from social conditions. They feed each other. The third force is external competition. When countries are competing economically and geopolitically, stability becomes strategic. Leaders worry not just about domestic outcomes, but relative strength. And that adds pressure to keep growth going, even if it comes at a long-term cost. The fourth force is real supply constraints. Whether it's energy, labor, or critical materials, when supply doesn't keep up with demand, money loses its anchor. You can create more claims, but you can't instantly create more real output. That imbalance shows up as price pressure. The fifth force is technology. Technology is deflationary in some areas and disruptive in others. It boosts productivity, but it also reshapes labor markets unevenly. That creates winners and losers, which feeds back into social tension and policy choices. What matters is not each force on its own, but how they compound. This is pressure building inside a closed system. Adjusting one variable pushes stress somewhere else. That's why outcomes feel confusing and contradictory. Most people, understandably, fall back on comforting assumptions. They assume money will go back to how it was. They assume savings are inherently safe. They assume that if pain comes, it will be shared evenly. As a risk manager, I can't rely on assumptions. I have to ask what happens if they fail. If money doesn't revert, what does that mean for planning? If savings lose purchasing power gradually, how does that affect behavior? If pain is distributed unevenly, what tensions emerge? I'm not predicting outcomes, I'm mapping risks. And the biggest risk I see is people anchoring to a past environment that no longer exists. That's when disappointment turns into shock. So how would I think about this personally? I wouldn't start with tactics. I'd start with mindset. I'd accept that cycles change and that flexibility matters more than precision. I'd think in terms of time horizons, not snapshots. I'd diversify not just assets, but assumptions. When I protect myself, I focus on resilience, on not needing one outcome to be right, on staying humble about what I don't know. I've learned the hard way that confidence without adaptability is fragile. And I'd remind myself of this one principle. Those who understand how systems relieve pressure are rarely surprised by the outcome.